Now, the American Gunsmithing Institute presents another instructional video on firearms design, operation, maintenance, and repair.
Welcome to the Armor's course on the AR-15. This particular gun is made by Colt, and it's a very early sample, and they've changed quite a bit. The gun and its designer have a rather interesting history. The gun was designed by Eugene Stoner while they worked for Armalite Corporation, which was a division of the Fairchild Aircraft Industries. And he worked on this gun, I think, quite a while, and made several versions, and he went on after that to design several more different firearms. The gun uses a system designed by a Swede, I think, in the 30s, called the Jungmann system. The basic gas system then is the Jungmann system. The other parts of it are variations of a lot of other common guns. Gone through quite an evolution. In fact, this gun came out in .308 and in belt-fed versions and straighter versions and more crooked versions. Finally, Fairchild, I think, got tired of Armalite and started selling off the things that they were making, like the Armalite AR-7 and this AR-15 that they sold to Colt. And Colt sold it to the military and has made 8 or 10 of them at least, maybe millions, I don't know. After Eugene Stoner finished more or less perfecting the AR-15, he went on to design several other guns, a .22 automatic and a lightweight 12-gauge automatic shotgun that no one could shoot because it kicked so hard. It didn't weigh much, but it really kicked. And then he went on to perfect this design and brought it out through the Armalite Corporation as an Armalite AR-18 or 180, the 180 being the semi-automatic version. I have an example of it here. This is the American-made one, and it is actually quite a bit of an improvement over the AR-15. It has a few disadvantages, but there's lots of advantages to it. This gun was made by 3 countries, here in the United States, then in Japan, and then in England by Sterling, and then went out of production altogether. Once Armalite stopped production on the AR-180, and he pretty well decided to stop production on everything. And so the Armalite Corporation as such kind of went away. Colt went on with this gun because they bought the rights to it, went on with this gun to make many, many variations. This, as I said before, is a very early version, has no forward assist, has a triangular handguard split on each side, right and left, has a different kind of a sling swivel than is current, and does not have a chrome-plated bore or inside of the bolt carrier is not chrome-plated. Here we have a later version, heavy barrel, and it has a forward assist, different sling swivel, and this is a short or a fairly short version. This also has a faster, much faster rifling twist and handles a heavier bullet much better. In fact, it handles it quite well. You'll also notice the difference in the handguard, and this particular one is round, and the 2 halves come off top and bottom, which is an advantage. They're also the same, so that if you break one half, you don't have to buy a whole handguard. You can put on another half. Top or bottom, they're interchangeable. And we have another version over here. This version is basically the same, forward assist, same type of sling swivel, same type of handguard, longer barrel, still heavy. And this is just about the heaviest one they make. This particular gun is an aftermarket. It's not made by Colt, although I'm sure it has some Colt parts in it. The bulk of it is made by someone else. And there's a lot of people that made receivers for these guns, and a lot of people made parts for these guns. And in fact, we have a short version with a telescoping stock and a very short barrel. And we have a 9mm version made by Colt and a few other aftermarket people. And here's an example of what we're talking about. That's not made by Colt, but it is a very short version. That's a submachine gun. But they also made it in semi with a little longer barrel. There have been several variations or versions of flash hiders. On this early gun, we have the original three-prong style. On the Armalite AR-180, we have another version of it, a little slightly different, a little heavier. Then we went to what some people call a birdcage flash hider, which is this one. This one doesn't have any vents on the bottom. I think it's in an attempt to make it not rise as much. Call it a recoil reducer, if you will. And this Colt has the same type. A few more slots. After the AR-15 and the AR-180, why Armalite kind of went away, and Eugene Stoner went on his way and went on to produce the Stoner 63 weapon system, which was kind of like the Heckler and Koch. One basic gun could be converted into many different calibers, different weights, and different types of feed, belt fed, clip fed, whatever. Well, to help you visualize how it works, I've taken the handguard off of this particular gun, and I've taken another gun apart to have the bolt out, and I've assembled the hammer and trigger on the outside of the receiver. Anyway, the way the gun operates is it is a gas system, and the barrel has a gas hole in it in the front sight. Interestingly enough, this is called the front sight. The actual post or front sight itself is called the front sight post. So if you'd order a front sight, you'd get this funny looking thing here. Okay, the front sight has a hole drilled in it underneath the sling swivel. You can probably just barely see it right here. That hole goes clear through the front sight and up into this area up here. Then they've drilled another hole in here and put in a hollow tube. They drill a matching hole in the barrel. And this front sight is held on by two tapered pins, and they're very, very tight. And in theory, they align with the hole in the barrel. So if there's a hole from the barrel, aligning with the hole in the front sight, there's another hole in the front sight going this way, and the tube is stuck in it, and there's a hole in the gas tube. The gas tube is held in place by this small roll pin, and the gas then flows out the barrel, into the front sight, into the tube, and down the tube, and into the receiver. And inside the receiver is this bolt. And it's locked shut like so. The gas tube is in here. The gas flows through the tube, through what they call a key, and into the bolt carrier. Now the bolt carrier has a firing pin at one end, and the bolt head at the other end, and a small chamber in here between it. And the gas fills this up like a balloon. Well, the gas has to go someplace, so it tries to push the firing pin out, and it tries to push the bolt head out. Well, the bolt head is against a cartridge which is being fired, and it can't go forward very much at all. The firing pin is held in by a pin. It looks like a cotter pin, but it's not. It can't come out. So what happens then, the only thing that can move is the bolt carrier. So the bolt carrier is pushed back rapidly. Now it can't turn because the key is in the slot in the receiver and prevents it from turning, so as the bolt is driven back, bolt carrier is driven back, the bolt head rotates. That unlocks it. Now there's a massive cam right here, bolt cam. You see it's in a cam slot. So as the bolt carrier backs away, the cam hits that edge of the slot and now forces the only thing it can turn to turn. That's the bolt head. So the bolt head turns. That unlocks it. And then the bolt carrier bottoms out in the slot and carries the bolt head back with it. So it's that, like a balloon, the gas comes down the tube, fills this chamber, and blows things apart. But they're held together by pins, so it just makes them longer. The only thing that gets longer is the bolt carrier is driven back rapidly, then it carries everything back with it. Now, when it starts back, of course, the hammer is setting here against the firing pin. So as the bolt moves back, it starts to force the hammer back. We'll go to the gun that I have it built up on the side. Okay, here we have the hammer and trigger assembly built up on the outside of the gun. The bolt carrier would be setting like this. When it's driven back, it starts to push the hammer back. As it goes all the way back, it will push the hammer all the way back. Now the trigger would be pulled at this mode, and I'm going to pull it. Hammer's being driven back, and you see right here, there's a secondary sear system. This piece is called the disconnect. This is the secondary sear on the hammer. And that lobe of metal below it strikes the disconnect and forces the disconnect to cam back. And it snaps over that notch of the hammer and catches the hammer. The trigger's still pulled. The bolt finishes the cycle and comes forward. So the bolt is now locked, shut. In the process, of course, it stripped the round from the magazine and pushed it in the chamber. The bolt is closed, fresh round in the chamber. The hammer's cocked, but being held by the secondary sear system. The trigger's still pulled, secondary sear system is holding. Here's the primary sear system, it's free, not holding. We release the trigger, the secondary starts to let go, and you see the primary sear of the trigger starting to engage behind the full cock notch of the hammer. The secondary is letting go, and the primary is gaining engagement. Finally, the secondary has released, and the hammer will fall from the secondary sear system to the primary system. So it falls from here to here. This particular gun is not falling very far. A second pull of the trigger repeats the process. Hammer falls, gun cycles, pushes the hammer back, hits the disconnect, forces it out of engagement, re-engages on top, let go of the trigger, it lets go, primary engages, catches hammer. Really pretty simple. It's a very common system. Common to many, many guns, including the AK-47. Now what we just described, if we had a chamber, of course, would be enough to let the gun work. There's a couple other parts in here, gadgets that make it a little handier to use. One, of course, is a bolt stop on the last round. When the gun cycles, the bolt stop is engaged by the empty magazine or the follower of the empty magazine and holds the bolt back. You can take the magazine out, the bolt will not close. On this side is where it is. And if you want to push it, the bolt will close. It's going to make a noise. You can engage it without a magazine by pulling the bolt back and pulling this in your finger or pushing here with your thumb locks the bolt back. That's a handy gadget. It's not an absolute necessity. Some military fighting type guns do not have a bolt stop, and included would be a SIG and most AK-47s. I'm going to close the bolt and open the gun up. And I get the gun open, you press this pin and pull it out. The detent's gone on this particular model, so I can pull it clear out. We open it up, and you can see the hammer living in its quarters down here, and I'll show you how this one works. I'm going to pull the trigger and let it fall. I push it back, and the trigger's pulled. I push it back. Now when I let go of the trigger, the hammer will creep forward because the secondary sear system is a negative engagement angle, and the hammer will fall and be caught by the primary sear system. Now I pull the trigger, the primary lets go, hammer falls, ignition, bolt cycles, pushes it back. It's now caught on the secondary system, primary system. Now, in semi-mode, this next gadget really isn't necessary. But in full auto, this thing makes a difference. It's called a buffer. And what it is it's a device that controls the cyclic rate of the gun. Push this little peg down and take out our buffer, and we can kind of wiggle and jiggle. Excuse me. And here's our buffer. They make different weights of buffers and different styles of buffers. By style, I mean the innards are different. You hear it rattling. Inside the buffer is a series of metal washers and rubber washers, and this one's a little loose. But the more weight you have, the slower the cyclic rate. Also, if you have lots of rubber in relation to the steel, then the rubber flexes more, and that slows it down. So you can change your cyclic rate by adding weight or by making the rubber more resilient, so it flexes more, so that the buffer stays back a little longer. There's short ones and long ones, and there's heavy ones and light ones. The lighter it is, the faster the cyclic rate, and the heavier it is, the slower the cyclic rate. In semi, it doesn't mean any difference, but in full, it does make a difference. And the guns shoot pretty fast with a light buffer. Okay. Another doodad that we have is the ejection port cover. The gun will work fine without it, but if you're in dirt or dust, this will keep some of it out. When the gun cycles or is shot, or when you work it by hand, it opens automatically. It opens automatically because this has a little knob on it, if you will, a housing, and it houses the detent plunger that holds it shut. And the bolt has a cutout for it here. When the bolt opens, it runs into that little housing and forces it away, which forces the detent to lose its grip. And that's about all the accessories it has that you don't have to have other than a safety, and you don't have to have a safety. On the full auto version, the safety also has another leg on it and another position, and allows the gun to fire safe, fire, and full. There's also some that have a 3-shot burst control segment. So, and this gun's safe and fire. Some would have safe, fire, and semi, and some would have 3-shot burst also. Before I show you the last little doodad that kind of pinpoints what a geek gun this is, I should show you how the bolt lock works. And I have this receiver assembly only, and I have a magazine in it. And right here's the bolt lock or bolt stop. When the magazine is empty or full with ammo in it, the follower is down in the magazine box, and the spring for the bolt lock pushes the bolt lock into inactive position. As the gun is emptied, the follower rises, and the end of the follower strikes the bolt lock and forces it up. So once it's empty, the follower rises, and the bolt catches here and stops. Now when you take the magazine out, it will stay engaged because there's a bolt against it right here. In this case, it will pop down. But it would normally be up. You could insert a new magazine, and then in order to close the bolt, you either pull it back a little ways, which would allow this to drop, or you would push it with your thumb, which would close the bolt. Now, you probably wonder what these serrations on the side of the bolt are for. And this is the new style bolt. If you notice in the early gun that we showed at first, it does not have any of these serrations. It does not have a forward assist either. I can't believe that we did this to a military firearm, but we put the closing device on it. What it is the serrations on the bolt, or we serrated the bolt, and then we put this plunger, spring-loaded plunger, that has some flex to it. The nose can move a little bit, so it wants to go in this way, but can flex out this way. And so if you're out in the field in a rice paddy and the gun is full of rice holes and who knows what, and you shoot it and the bolt doesn't go closed, in theory, now, you can happily push on this repeatedly, which closes the bolt for you. I can't believe it. An operating handle would have done the same thing quicker. Anyway, that about wraps up how it works. We'll start on how to take it apart and how to do whatever has to be done to it. I'll show you how to take this sucker apart, and then we'll clean it and go over it a little bit. I only have 1/2 the handguard on. To take it off, you pull this slip ring down against fairly stout spring tension and slip the handguard off. It looks easier than it is, actually. And then we have a collar around the barrel. You see it, the serration's pretty well there. That's what holds the barrel on. And I will show you how that works without actually taking one apart here in a few minutes. Well, now that we have the handguard off, we'll continue getting this thing naked. Take off the pistol grip and the buttstock next. And then screw inside the pistol grip. Take a pretty good sized screwdriver and stick it in the screw slot and unscrew it. Now when you do that, there'll be a little spring underneath it. Don't lose it. I didn't get all the way out. There we go. And my little spring fell out. Fits inside here. And it also fits inside the receiver right here. And it pushes on the safety detent, which is a gadget that holds the safety in also. So we'll dump them out. Hopefully they'll fall out. There we go. The safety could now come out if I wanted to take it out. We'll now take out the buttstock, and once again we have a little spring we got to watch for. The buttstock is held on by one screw. It's the one on the top of the stock. Buttstock's now free. I can slip it off. This screw will fall out. Well, I think we'll take the butt plate off the buttstock and show you what's in there. This is the magic hidden compartment. This screw holds the butt plate on and the sling swivel on. Sling swivel just slips out. And we have a compartment in the stock. Butt plate fits over it. Butt plate has a trap door. So you can put goodies in there. Food, ammunition, cleaning equipment, oil, whatever you think you need. Okay, now we have the detent spring for the takedown pin. And when you take the buttstock off, you have to be careful that this doesn't fall out, because if you tip it up, it'll fall out, or very likely will, and so will a small plunger. This is not going to fall. I'll bet the plunger doesn't either. Oh, it did. And there's our little plunger. It's the same on both ends, so that the honorable soldier can't put it in wrong. They're not all the same on both ends, though. Now, we can push out the takedown pin. There's no detent to hold it, so it'll slip right out. The gun will open up now. I'm going to unscrew this screw. Now some guns, you'll have to take two screwdrivers, one on each side. Other guns are loose enough or have a stop, a detent that holds one end of it. We're going to unscrew the screw. Got it. Then we can pull out the hinge. They're not all that tight. I like them tight because it keeps the top and bottom halves, pretty much rattle-free. Helps accuracy some. The bottom and the top come off. We got it apart. If we didn't want to take it completely apart, but just simply wanted to clean the bolt, we could take out the rear takedown pin and leave it stick out this side that the detent would hold it. And then simply take out the bolt, which we're going to do now. And just take the charging handle, and it has a little lock on it. So grab it here. It pulls the lock out of engagement. We can pull the charging handle back. That pulls the bolt out. This will go about like so. You can pull the bolt clear out. And the key is in the handle. So when the bolt's free, we just drop it down. The key clears the handle. We can take the bolt assembly out. Then with the charging handle, a little ridge in it and a gap. We'll find the gap and drop the handle down and pull it out. And here's the little ears. And there's a notch in the receiver that they fit into, and they go in the groove. There it is. Okay. Now, the top is almost apart. If you want to take the port cover off, you take this little C-clip off of the hinge right here. Be careful it doesn't fly away, because it'll try to. Then slide the hinge out. Being careful not to lose the spring when you pull the hinge out. So put your finger over it, pull the hinge out, you won't lose the spring. To put it back together, you put the cover in place, start the hinge, When it gets to here, you put the spring in and start the hinge in the spring. And you get to about here, then you have to push the spring into place. You have to fold it up like this and push it down and push the hinge the rest of the way through. When the groove lines up, put your C-clip back on, hinge is reassembled. Now, for the forward assist, you do pretty much the same thing. You can see a roll pin right here. You would drive the roll pin out, and the forward assist will come right out the back. And there's nothing magic about that. You won't lose anything. Now, most of us will not be taken down any farther than this for any normal type of maintenance or cleaning, but there are times when you have to go a little bit farther. Now, if you shoot lead bullets, the gas tube will tend to get plugged up. So, if you have cast lead bullets in 223, it'll plug up the gas tube. If you have a 22 rimfire conversion unit, and they make them, and you shoot very much in it, it'll plug up the gas tube. Now, my suggestion here is that if you're going to shoot lead bullets, you have to chase a few real ones down there every now and then. With a 22 rimfire, at least every 100 rounds, you're going to have to put 4 or 5 rounds of 223 through it. So it'll blow the lead that accumulates out of the tube and keep it clear. Now, I suppose it could get plugged in normal usage with real ammo, but I have never seen it happen. We'll take the gas tube out. The gas tube is held in place by a very small roll pin right here. We'll drive that roll pin out. Roll pin's out. Now the gas tube, believe it or not, will pull out and go into the receiver. Then you can push it all the way through, or you can pull it out this way. Doesn't matter. That's our gas tube. Most of them, if they're Colt or quality, will be hard. They're stainless steel and they're pretty hard. And they fit in the bolt key like so. So the gas would flow out the barrel, through the front sight, through the hole in the gas tube, and down the gas tube into the key, at which time it blows the bolt carrier rearward. The gas tube gets plugged. You can take a little teeny wire, a piece of wire pretty stiff, the flat end, but smaller than that hole, and work it back and forth in here. This end is plugged. That's normal. So you have to scrape the dirt out and dump it out that hole. So your best bet is not to let it get plugged. So if you're shooting lead bullets, shoot jacketed bullets through it every 100 rounds or so, and shoot 3 or 4 of them to blow the dirt, the lead, free. Now, frankly, the lead will go into the bolt assembly, so you have to clean the bolt assembly before you do too much more shooting. Okay, gas tube's out. Now we have the front sight, and it's held in by 2 tapered pins. You can see them here. And these are tight. I don't recommend normally that you take off the front sight, but there are times when you might have to. It's damaged or broken or plugged or something like that. This, for the home shop, is a tough job. What you want to do is take a block of lead or something else that won't mar the gun but has a lot of mass, and determine which side of the pin is the big end, and don't miss. Now you see one size, a bigger size. Then lay the front sight on the block of lead. I like lead because it doesn't leave marks, and the leather coated it doesn't leave any marks at all, right? Just kidding. Now this is important. We have something with a lot of mass, yet won't leave marks. We have the front sight resting on it. We take a punch that's a little bit smaller than the end of that pin, and we grind a concave in the end of it. We take a ball peen hammer bigger than this one, and this punch is very short. We put it over the pin and then hit it a good firm blow with about a half-pound ball peen. Smart. The idea is to start the roll pin, start the tapered pin. If you just peck at it, you'll simply rivet at the end over and you won't get it out. And then you have to drill it, and they're hardened. So you got to drill carefully. Carbide works fine. So I don't recommend you take the front sight off, but if you do, that's how you go about it. And you get them started. Once they start, because they're tapered, they'll come right out, and you can use a regular punch and a regular hammer. But to get them started, you can't mess around. You get with the big gun first. And both pins go directly on the lead block. So you support it here and punch out the front one, then you move it forward and punch out the rear one. Now I've cheated. I have pre-loosened these pins, but I'll show you how I go about it. I have the right punch on here. In this case, I used a big one to get it started because it was really tight. I put it directly over it, and I hit it very, very hard. Wham! That'll start the pin. Now once it starts, it'll come out easily. I just drag it out. Now the front sight will be tight, but should come off without too much hassle. I haven't taken this front sight off. The front sight is off. And there's our gas hole. Now you can see a little ring around it. That ring is there because the hole in the front sight is that big. Whoops, that big. It's bigger than the gas hole in the barrel. They do that so it'll help in alignment of the barrel, of the front sight on the barrel. So when you look at this, you'll see a ring all the way around. As long as you have a little bit of this line on the outside of that little hole, we're okay. But if the front sight doesn't align, you'll see the circle off center and will come into here. Now that's actually restricting the gas flow out of the barrel into the front sight and into the gas tube in the action. We correct that by taking out the sling swivel, which is riveted in, so you have to unrivet it, and then drifting this hole. Now when this is off, the hole we're talking about is right up in here. And come in with a burr and drift that hole in the front sight the direction you want it to go. Now you might have to come in from this angle to smooth it up. You want the hole to be smooth on the inside, but now it's oval. It's larger in diameter than it used to be. So what we're doing is we're moving the hole, which used to be like this, to here. The reason we do this is so that no part of the orifice hole in the barrel is covered by any part of the front sight. In other words, it's a hole completely around the hole in the barrel. Now you don't have to do this very often on Colt guns, but occasionally, but lots of times on aftermarket guns. Now on the car or short barrel versions, the gas hole is closer to the peak pressure area, and the hole will be smaller and more critical. And lots of times you have to take the front sight off and adjust that gas hole size for the ammo being used. The short barrel guns are very critical on the load, where the farther from the chamber that the gas hole is, the more tolerant it is to variations in gas pressure. Okay, the gun's about apart. We have one more area that we're not going to take apart, but we'll talk about it and show how to do it. And that is if we want to remove the barrel. The system is very similar to that on the AR-7. I'll show you how that operates. We have a barrel with a shoulder on it, and screwed onto the end of that is a barrel extension that the bolt locks into. And this whole mess slips inside the receiver just like this one does. And then the collar comes down and screws onto it. Now that collar has a shoulder that bears against this shoulder. So as you screw it in, it pushes the barrel into the receiver and holds it in the receiver. It's exactly how the AR-15 works. With a special tool, a wrench that you can buy from Brownells or make, you put the wrench on the little collar and simply unscrew it. It is a right-hand thread. Now the wrench we made, it's like this. This is a heavy-duty one because we get some really, really tight ones. And if it's really bad, we put a hardened bolt through here to support the wrench so it can't even spring open. But anyway, the wrench straddles the barrel. We find the scallops and unscrew it. Remember, a right-hand thread. Now, there's lots of ways to do it. I put it in a barrel vise, and I hold it, and then I unscrew the nut from the receiver. We can get away with that because just like on the AR-7, there's a peg in the barrel extension and the slot in the receiver so that the barrel and receiver have to turn as a unit. So if I try to unscrew the collar from the receiver, the peg on the barrel will stop the receiver from rotating. There are some things, some tools that will hold the receiver when you unscrew the nut, and that's okay too. I just happen to do it this way, but you can have a receiver wrench and unscrew the nut while holding the receiver. If it's really, really tight, that's probably the best way to do it. But I've had some tight ones and we haven't had any problem. There's another gadget that we made that you would very seldom need to use. I made it out of an old bolt, a bolt head. I welded it onto here. And it's used in conjunction with another gadget, just a piece of steel. It's a limiter actually. It's actually a broken piece of a center drill of all things, but it fits inside the chamber. It fits inside the chamber and limits how deeply this tool can go. And the way it works, which is pretty slick, is that the barrel extension has matching recesses and lugs. So you put this tool into the chamber and then push this tool in. And what it does, it limits the engagement of this tool so that the lugs in the tool align with the lugs in the barrel extension. And then we can put a big wrench on this or a T-handle, and with the barrel in the barrel vise, we can simply unscrew the barrel extension. Now, normally you don't ever have to take that off, but if it's bad, had an overload or something, you want to save one component that's still good, we can separate the two that way. Also, in the event that you have headspace and cannot get another bolt head, you can actually do a barrel setback or have a qualified gunsmith do a barrel setback and rechamber and refit everything, and you have a working gun again that you couldn't have gotten working without new parts, and if you can't get them, that's the problem. This tool has to be made, of course. I don't think anybody makes one or sells one, and you'll have to have an old bolt, so you may not be making this tool. We just do this so it's a self-contained unit. Okay. We could take the rear side off, but I'm not going to, but that's pretty simple. You simply have a little roll pin here, you punch it out, and unscrew the disc and slide everything out. You use a bullet nose to push in the little plunger, at which time the disc can be turned. I wish I had a bullet nose here to make any adjustments. It'd be easier with a bullet, actually. And the front sight, of course, is adjustable in the same manner. Front sight post, you push in the plunger with a bullet nose, and you can turn that. They have a key to do it, but you can do it by hand if you have to. They're normally not real tight, and I'll try to turn this one. I push the detent. Yeah. There it is. I've turned it one cog. Okay, that'll pretty well wrap up the top. We'll go for the bottom. The bottom has the hammer, the trigger assembly, and the safety in it. We've taken the detent out for the safety, and the safety will just come right out now. Make a liar out of me. Safety usually comes right out now. Yeah, it does. Just a little stiff. Let the hammer down, drive out the 2 pins that hold in the hammer and the trigger assembly. Pull out the punch and the hammer will come out. The same with the trigger. The trigger and the disconnect will come out. The pin should come out, but this one seems to be burred, doesn't want to come out. It's coming out. Extremely tight. There we go. We can take out the buffer assembly and an action spring or recoil spring by pushing in this little plunger, allowing the buffer to come out, and the spring. And here's the little plunger we're talking about. That's what holds the buffer in place when you take the top off of the bottom. Now this is held in place by the end of the action spring tube. You can see it engaging here, right there. If we had to take that off, there's several different ways of attaching it, but this has a little collar. We simply unscrew the tube, back this away, and this would come out. Some have various locking detents. It depends on who made them and what series it is. Anyway, we're not going to take the tube off, but we will take the magazine catch out. It comes out pretty easily, actually. You push it way in, and the magazine catch proper comes completely free, and then we can just unscrew it. If we like it there, we can put it there. It'll lock itself in again. It's out. And there's the nut and the spring. Here's the catch. And the bolt stop comes out with a roll pin and a punch. Drive it out here. I'll do that too, why not? Not quite. That should be enough. Here comes our bolt stop, and here's the bolt stop plunger and spring. Now one word of caution here. I used the wrong punch because it's not really long enough and it got tight in the side of the receiver. You're better off to use a longer, thinner punch. It'll work better. We have one more part that I didn't talk about, and it's a little bottom that hinges on the trigger guard. So the bottom of the trigger guard will hinge open. So if you have cold weather and you have gloves on, this makes it handy for shooting. You push in this little plunger and push the guard down. Comes out like that. Now if I wanted to take it off, all I have to do is drive out that roll pin and this would come right off. The spring and plunger is at this end and it's captive. It's captive by a small roll pin right here. See it? If you had to take it out, you would drive out that pin and everything would come out the bottom there. You can see that. I think you can see that. Just the roll pin crosses across the hole and holds the 2-diameter plunger in and its spring. Now if you're wondering where the poor soldier in the Arctic with gloves on would have a punch to deactivate or push the plunger in, he has it. Every soldier should have several. Again, it's a bullet nose. The gun is designed to be at least field stripped and field operated with no tools, and at least nothing that you wouldn't have. And a soldier should always have bullets. Of course, if it's really stiff, you could use a hand grenade, and they'll have those too. Okay, we have one more item. We have not taken the bolt apart yet. It comes apart really easily. I'm not going to take the key off. The key is intended to stay, and you can see they've heavily staked that. Now you can take it off. You can take out these 2 Allen screws, and they're hardened and they're tight, and break this detent, or staking. They'll come out stiff, but they'll come out, and they have serrations on the edges, so they'll fight you all the way. Normally we don't mess with this. If the key gets loose, the gun will short cycle, so then you have to take it off and put in new bolts because they have a tendency to break. And we're going to leave those on. We take the bolt out by removing the firing pin, retaining pin. This pin's going to look like a cotter key, so don't be surprised, but it isn't a cotter key. It's very hard steel. Don't put a cotter key in because it only lasts a few rounds. The firing pin will shear through and you'll be lost to the gun that has the firing pin someplace in the action and no key. Alright, the firing pin will fall right at the bottom. When the firing pin is out, we can now rotate the cam pin. So push it back so it's in the way, we'll rotate it 90 degrees, and believe it or not, the cam pin will come out. Once it's out, we can pull the bolt out. This gun's dirty. I shot it several years ago and didn't clean it. Now on the bolt itself, of course, we have an extractor and a plunger and 3 little rings, much like the rings on a piston of a piston engine. Some people put great importance on these rings. I myself don't put too much importance on them. I have guns, or I have known of guns, that have 2 rings instead of 3, and they fly fine. If they're too tight, they will make the gun short cycle. And if that's the case, what I do is I polish out with fine emery, about 320, this chrome surface to get it a little bit smoother. You won't take out much metal. And then if I have to, I will take the rings off and buff the edges of them a little bit as a unit. I've never had to do much to the rings. I think only once in all the guns I've worked on have I had to touch the rings any, but I have polished out this on several guns, the inside of the bolt carrier itself. Anyway, if you have to take the rings off, it's kind of like the rings on a piston engine again. You would spread them and lift them off this way. Don't do it unless you have to because they frequently break. So this part you would normally not mess with. Sometimes you hear that the rings cause problems or wear out. Frankly, they're good for longer life than any other part of the gun, the barrel or the receiver or anything else. I wouldn't worry about it. As long as they're free, that's life. They work fine. Now the extractor comes out extremely easily. Have a little pin right here, and you just push on the extractor and then push on the pin. Sometimes they fall out. I had to pick that one out, but it wasn't hard. There's the extractor. And here's the extractor spring, and you'll notice that we have a little piece of rubber in there. The rubber has the tiniest little seat. In semi-automatic, that little piece of rubber isn't terribly critical. In full automatic, that piece of rubber is critical because it helps to dampen harmonics, to get the extractor to bouncing back and forth. And if it bounces when it has to extract, if it's up, it's done. It doesn't work. And then the extractor is held in, and the ejector is held in by a small roll pin right here. We drive out the roll pin, and the ejector will come out. This ejector has been modified to help improve ejection. Someone before me did that apparently. That should be enough. It is. And out comes our ejector, which is very similar to the ejector in a Remington 700 or a lot of other plunger ejector guns. Spring and the ejector. This does not give very many problems either. In really dirty conditions, the ejector may get stuck down the bolt. And if you have an overload, a really hot overload, you may drive the ejector back into the housing of the bolt so hard that it bends and welds itself in place or gets fluid brass around it, sticks it. But normally this is not a troublesome part either. Although when you clean the gun, when you seriously clean the gun, it's a good idea to take the ejector out and clean that area out and oil it too. Okay. This thing isn't very dirty, but I'm going to show you how I go about cleaning the gun anyway. And I use a little different method than most people. I use water, and I use a biodegradable soap. I use Simple Green, but there's lots of products like it on the market, and they all do a good job. I'm just going to clean a few parts of this gun, show you how I do it. Then we'll oil it and assemble it. I got the bolt assembly and the hammer, the bolt stop and the bolt carrier. You just get them wet, and you don't even have to get them wet. The solution seems to work a bit better if it's damp. And then we'd hose it down. Let it set for a few minutes, and then there's some places that might have some thick accumulations of dirt and grime and grease, so we'll take a toothbrush and clean those off. And this bolt body, the bolt head itself did have some corrosion here and a little along here, so we'll just kind of scrub that. Everything else is actually pretty good. Then we simply rinse it off. And the same with the bolt carrier. Now, if I had a whole gun, I would have done the whole gun the same way. But this one really isn't dirty, and I'll take the time to clean the whole thing. But you got the gist of it. Now we'll let this drain for a little while, and we'll set it on a paper towel, let it dry for a while. When it's dry, or if we can take an air hose and blow it out, but once it's dry, we will then oil it with oil and assemble the gun. I used to use cleaning solvents to clean guns with, and frankly it's harder on your hands and it's harder to get rid of. And if you have corrosive primers, and with some of the Chinese and Russian stuff that we're buying, they are corrosive primed ammunition. It is corrosive primed ammunition. So just plain old petroleum distillate solvents don't clean that off very well. The water and the soap gets that real clean, and it removes every trace of it, so that you don't have a rusting problem. If you do the receiver with the barrel on, and you normally would be, then you have to make sure it is absolutely dry before you start reassembling it. And that's true of any other part that might be a sub-assembly. This trap door for the butt plate is the same way. If you don't take it completely apart, then you have to make sure it's completely dry before you put it back together. So let this dry, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Through the miracle of video, it miraculously dried, and we're now ready to oil it and assemble it. I use brake free, but there's several things that are good, but I really do like the brake free. It cleans, and it's a good preservative, and it's a good lubricant. I just squirt it on everything, and it covers well, so I don't have to get it all over everything. It'll run there in time anyway. And if I had washed the barrel, then I would make sure that the barrel was thoroughly lubricated. I haven't, so I'm not going to spend too much time with it. And the same with the lower receiver. Then I'll just wipe off the excess, so I have a thin coat of oil on everything, so it's not running. You notice I did not oil the gas tube. I'm not sure it would hurt anything if you did. It's stainless steel, so it's not going to rust. And the pressures of the gas are quite high, and the temperature is high. So I think if you got oil in it, it would tend to burn and blow it out, but I'm not sure. So I don't make it a habit to oil the gas tube, and I would suggest you don't either. It's not going to rust. And I got some oil on it, so I'll wipe it off. I got some on the stock, so I'll wipe it off too. Now you notice that I didn't intentionally oil the stock, and I didn't intentionally oil the handguard or anything like that. I also didn't oil the buffer. The buffer is basically a sealed unit, so I wouldn't get much in it, and I don't take it apart to clean it, although you can. There's no need to. It's pretty well sealed. It doesn't get dirt inside. I want to get virtually all the oil off except what is actually in the surface pores of the steel. I don't want it dripping with oil. Although this is good oil and does not tend to oxidize, if I have it saturated, it will tend to pick up a little dirt and dust, and that can cause it to get kind of gummy and might make the gun short cycle or fail to feed or something. While you're doing this, it's a good time to check for wear on parts or cracked parts or something like that. This gun has only had about 50 rounds to it, so I don't think I'm going to find anything terribly wrong. But if it had been a used gun that had quite a few rounds to it, then I would look at things. The cam pins can break occasionally. I would check the extractor for a sharp hook. Just the normal stuff that you would normally do when you check a gun over. You also might check the sear system. But you can do that before you take it apart. Make sure that the primary is positive and the secondary is negative. Check for a loose key on the bolt carrier assembly. We already checked it, as you remember, and it's tight. But if it were loose, we'd have to fix that at this time. And those screws, those hardened cap screws, if it's loose, they are probably stretched. As a rule, that's what causes it. They're about ready to break, so I would replace them. I would not just tighten them, I would replace them. You might check or inspect the lower frame and the upper frame where they join. Once in a while they crack here, and that's a serious problem. You might just look it over as you're cleaning and make sure that it's not cracked. The same thing here. You check this area on the receiver to make sure there's no cracks. Okay. And I put them together in sub-assemblies first, or I should say I assemble the sub-assemblies, then I start assembling the two main units, and of course then last you put them together. We have 3 springs that are about the same length and diameter. 2 are exact, and one's a bit longer and smaller in diameter. The small one is the one that detents the takedown pin, so we'll put its little detention spring here. These 2 are the same. One is for the safety and one is for the ejector. We put the ejector in the bolt first. So we put in the spring and then push in the ejector. We push the ejector down and make sure that the little cutout lines up with the pinhole that's here. We push it down and drive the pin in. Take a punch and finish the job I started. Went a little bit too far. Perfect. Okay, that takes care of our ejector. You might take a punch and make sure that it goes in and free, and it is. Then the extractor. Remember that we have the little rubber piece with the little flange in the bottom. That goes into the extractor. Now the extractor spring is open on one end, and that's to hold it so it won't fall out. So when the soldier's out in the field decides he has to clean his gun, he won't lose the extractor spring because the gun won't extract without it, period. Now the hook, the extractor is very hard and the hook doesn't wear rapidly, but they will wear. And if this hook angle, the part that pulls the rim out right there, should wear a little bit and get rounded, it will occasionally, and then as it wears more constantly, drop the case and leave it partway in the chamber, or maybe completely in the chamber, depends on how bad it is. Anyway, this is new and it looks okay. If it were bad, you'd replace the extractor, or with a small grinding wheel, come in and true that surface up. But be careful, because if you go too far, it's going to hit the rim too hard and have a tendency to tear through it. You want it just enough to clean up, no more. Take my magic pin, push it in. Now the basic bolt now is assembled. The bolt carrier doesn't have anything special in it. If you remember, everything's added later. So we'll put in the bolt body into the bolt carrier and line up the extractor so it is on the right hand side, since this is a right hand ejecting gun, and line up the hole that goes through the bolt carrier and the bolt, so the slot and the hole line up, and push in the cam pin. Now the cam pin will clear the key when it's turned 90 degrees. Then you turn it 90 so that the hole in the cam pin lines up with the hole in the bolt assembly for the firing pin. We drop in the firing pin. And here's a good time to talk about the firing pin. My spec and military spec are a little bit different. The military guns use very precise ammo, and they hold headspace very, very closely. In the sporting world, that tolerance is loosened up, and so we have primers that aren't all flush seated. Some are deep seated. We have more variation in the total length of the cartridge case, or the total length of the cartridge case from base to shoulder at least. And we allow a little more headspace before we have to fix it, or think we have to fix it. So my spec is that the firing pin protrusion should be between 40 and 50. The military spec is between 19 and 20 and 39. So it's considerably less than mine. But if you have a deep-seated primer that's seated, let's say 15 thousandths deep, and that does occur, and you have a firing pin that sticks out 19 thousandths, there's no way on earth it's going to fire that gun. So at 40, it will. You don't have to change it, but what I'm saying is if you have one that's 43 thousandths worth of protrusion, don't worry about it. You drop the firing pin in, and you can check the protrusion, and it's not excessive. In fact, it's pushing 40, it's probably 35. And then you also check the diameter of the tip. I wiggle the base and I look at the tip, watch it move. See, I have hardly any movement at all. And that's important. If for some reason, if the hole was eroded large, or someone opened it up, or the pin tip was eroded small, or somebody polished it and made it small, and you had more than 3 or 4 thousandths difference in the diameter of the pin and the diameter of the pin hole, you would need to replace whatever's offending. Or if the pin diameter was under 65 thousandths, I should say if the hole diameter was under 65 thousandths, you could make a new firing pin to fit the hole. But if it's over 65 thousandths, you're going to have to do something with that oversized firing pin hole. Anyway, we now have the assembly assembled except for the firing pin retaining pin, which we slip in. And now that assembly is together and won't fall apart. And you see, the firing pin that passes through the cam pin locks it so it can't rotate and come out. So everything's locked in place. Once again, the military and I somewhat disagree. The military firing pin tip shape is a hemisphere, and this is a high-intensity cartridge. I prefer what I call a modified hemisphere. That is, the pin tip is hemispherical, then the very tip of it is flattened slightly, so its radius is approximately 4 times that of its diameter. And then it's a slightly blunted firing pin tip, and it won't make the primer quite as thin in the center. I use that shape for high-intensity cartridges. Now, if you're going to use a stock pin, it'll be a hemisphere, and if the stock dimensions are there, you have nothing to worry about. But if you have to make one, I would follow the modified hemisphere rule, and that is just slightly blunted at the tip after you make it a hemisphere. Okay, I think we'll assemble the lower receiver right now. We've got a bolt stop and a bolt stop spring and plunger to put in. If you remember, we did not punch the roll pin completely out on that one, so it's sticking out right here. Take a punch and drive it forward until it's just about flush. I went a bit too far, so I'll just force it back a little bit. The only reason I do this is it makes it a little easier to line everything up and drive the pin in. I got the spring and plunger in. I will now put the bolt stop in place. I think I'll put this pin too to kind of line it up. And I'll take a larger punch and I'll start this. And I check it, make sure it's free, and it is. Then we'll put in the magazine catch. Remember, this is a great big giant screw. And this is a good time to check the catch surface. They rarely wear because they are hard, but this is the area that catches the magazine, and you can see it's nice and sharp yet. A little bluing wear on it, but that's about it. The magazine catch spring, and the magazine catch button, which is also the magazine catch nut. And we'll screw in our catch. You screw it in until the end of the shaft is approximately flush with the, flush with the outside of the button. I got one more turn to go, although it's not that critical. There we go. That's where we like it. If it's backed off, the spring has less tension. That's about all that's wrong with having it a little bit looser. If it has less tension, it might drop a magazine. Okay. Now we can put in the fire control. Actually, I like to put in the plug, the buffer and the plug. I'm sorry, the buffer. And you look in this, you'll see that it has some flat sides. If it turns to the flat side, if I didn't have oily hands, it's easier to get it out. So when I put it in, I make sure that I rotate it so that it's larger diameter. I don't have to worry about it popping out should I touch it or jar it. And the first thing that goes in, of course, is the trigger mechanism. I didn't take the springs off or out of the trigger mechanism, so I don't have to put them back. But they come off relatively simply, and this one just pulls out. When I put it in the gun, I want to tension the spring against the inside floor of the lower receiver, something like that. So that tensions the trigger upward. So I'll put the trigger in first and put the pin through one side of the trigger. Then I'll put the disconnect in and push the pin the rest of the way through. I just drop it in and I line up the hole and I select one of my favorite pins and put in. I push the pin through until it's flush with the inside wall. Now I have room for the disconnect to go in there. Pick up my disconnect, drop it in place, and then line up the hole and push it in. Now when I get to this side, I have to kind of push the trigger over to line up the hole. The pin goes through. Now when I get it together, this pin is not detented. So if I were shooting and this pin weren't detented, this pin would tend to work out. If detented by the hammer spring, the leg of the hammer spring, the rest on top of it is a small groove, and this leg will fit in that groove and keep that pin from coming out. The hammer pin, if detented, you can just barely see it. You can see it right there. There's a spring. The hammer has a hole in it, and it comes up to here, and they put the spring in, and they hit the hammer in a punch and bend it so it cannot come out. And that's what detents this spring. So well, I have to drive it out with a punch now. We'll put the hammer in, but first we'll put the spring on it. Maybe we'll put the spring on it. Now the hammer goes in the gun the same way with the legs against the floor, except that in reality they're resting on that pin. And so it tensions the hammer like this. So when we cock it, it's tension, and it wants to fly forward, strike the firing pin. There we have it. The fire control is almost assembled. What's next? The safety. And for this we'll need to have the gun cocked because the trigger's in the way in the uncocked position. It's in. When you go to put the plunger and spring in, put the safety in either the safe or fire position so that the groove and the safety lines up, and put the plunger and spring in place. Now it won't go in very deep, so now's the time to put the pistol grip back on. The pistol grip has a hole in it. It's usually easier also to stick the spring in the hole in the pistol grip, then lay the gun on the side. Remember, the plunger's in the hole in the frame and the spring's in the pistol grip. Slide it on. Make sure the spring goes in the hole and screw it on. On. Now we'll assemble the buttstock and put it on the lower receiver. There's not much in the buttstock, but what's there has to be, otherwise it won't stay on. We put our trapdoor in place and put the screw through to kind of retain it. And we screw this onto the stock. That screw goes in the bottom. Put the butt plate in place, put the sling swivel in place, and screw the screw in. The screw goes into the sling swivel. So the butt plate screw holds the butt plate and the sling swivel in place. So now we'll put the takedown pin in and then the buttstock. Takedown pin goes in with its groove toward the rear, and then the plunger is the one that is the same on both ends. Stick it in the hole, put the spring in the hole, and now the buttstock's ready to go on. Now if you get careless, you can kink the spring, so make sure that it goes into the hole in the receiver. Kind of hold the buttstock there and put in the screw. This gun has another part. They don't all have this. It's a little spacer. You see, this buttstock's longer than some of them. The spacer holds it tight. The lower unit now is pretty well assembled. We'll work on the upper assembly. If you remember right, we took off or took loose our front sight. We're going to have to put it back. And I like to have it pretty juicy when I put the pins in, so we'll do that. But I'll get it lined up first. Now this should go down without too much hassle. Okay. Kind of line it up and it's off. Now our holes should pretty well line up, and they do. And we put our forearm retainer in place and make sure that the hole in the retainer lines up with the hole in the front sight. It does. Now sometimes it'll be too tight to turn easily when you put the pins in. Other guns, it'll still turn easily with the pins in. What locks it in place for real, of course, is the gaff tube, but it's not in yet. Okay, now we'll put our tapered pins back in place, and I'm going to squirt some oil down here. And I'll roll the pins in the oily paper towel. Take our lead rock and lay the gun on it and drive in the pins. Now once again, you've got to put the right end in first. Put the small end of the pin in the big hole. Take a punch and drive them in. They're in, they're tight, everything looks okay. And this particular gun, our retainer is loose, movable. A word on the pins, they're not real critical on how far they go in. I go about so that they're about even on both ends. If you go too far, you stretch the hole. And then you have to drive the pin deeper and deeper and deeper. It looks bad, and it's stretching the metal, and probably, in reality, particularly in a thinner barrel gun, you're starting to dent the bore on the inside, and if you do, accuracy is lost. So use some caution here. These things are lined up in a fixture, drilled and reamed on the taper, and the pins are driven in I'm not sure. I think by hydraulic press it's automatic if I remember right. I saw it, but I forgot. It's been a long time. So when you do it, you stop when they're just about even. It's fine. It's not that critical. Okay, we got that on. We want to put on the gas tube. If you remember, we pushed it back, pulled it out, and then pulled it out frontwise. It'll actually go in from the rear, but I find this way usually a little bit easier. Now a word on the barrel retaining nut. Remember that most of the time you'll not be taking a barrel off. They're not intended to come off very often. But if you do take it off, the spec calls for a certain torque. And what the military says, at least I've been told, is you go to the torque figure, and then if one of the scallops don't line up with the hole in the upper receiver, you continue to turn until it does. My spec is this: you turn it on until it gets good and snug, and then keep turning until one of the scallops lines up. Now if you're very close to it, and you can back up maybe a few thousandths, do that. Otherwise, continue to go forward until it lines up. Now don't brute force it. I'm saying snug. That means a good arm twist with this wrench is snug, and then make the scallop line up. With that said, we're ready to put the gas tube in. Now, we need to line up the hole in the spring-loaded collar with one of the scallops. The one that lines up with the hole in the receiver right here. So now we have the hole in the receiver, the hole in the C-clip, the scallop, and I've got the wavy spring in there out of alignment. But we'll pick that up. There it is. I just put a punch in and lined it up. Spun it around. See, it spins pretty easily. And now my holes are all lined up. Now I put the gas tube in. Turn it around. Make sure that my hole's in the bottom so when it goes in the front sight it'll do something. Push it forward until the hole in the gas tube lines up with the hole in the front sight. I shot past it, and there it is. Put a small punch in to align it. I'll put in my roll pin. Now if you remember, we had the front sight off and we checked the alignment of the hole, and on this gun it's good. I didn't mention, but you can also check the alignment of the hole in the gas tube with the hole in the front sight the same exact way. When you pull the tube out, you can have a look-see. If it's way off, you have to open the hole up to make it right. Okay, now we're about ready to put on the handguard. Remember that there's no right and left, up and down. The two halves on the new guns are the same. The old guns, of course, the triangular forearm, and some aftermarket ones, if I remember right, are still left and right, even though they might be round. Okay, the top's almost assembled. We want to put in our charging handle. Remember that it goes in and this little bulge here finds a hole. Pushes forward, take the bolt, put the key up into the charging handle and shove the unit. Ah, we forgot something. Bolt must be in unlocked position. Pull the bolt head forward. And in we go. Now we're almost ready to put in the lower unit. We have the two screws and nut. Some of them have spring-loaded plungers. There's several different ways of attaching the top and bottom of the receivers. This one screws. Now if I want it real tight, I'd take 2 screwdrivers, one on this side, one on this side, and cinch it down. Don't break the receiver, but snug it up. This one's pretty snug the way it is, I'm going to leave it. And we push out our rear takedown pin until it stops against the detent. Close the gun, push the pin in, the magazine in, and see if everything seems to work. Good. Let's try making sure it shoots. Pull the trigger. Doesn't work, it's on safe. Take it off safe, pull the trigger, bang, trigger still pulled, cycle the bolt. Bang. Probably assembled correctly. Well, I think I'll talk about a few tricks that you can do to make things a little better or make sure things are going to work reliably. We'll talk about the ejector first. The ejector, this has been modified and not necessary on this particular type of model, but some things to check for. The ejector must be free. It must have pretty firm tension. If it feels lethargic toward the end of its stroke, I would replace the spring or at least give it a good stretch. And one thing that's extremely important is that the ejector must not come out past the front surface of this or forward surface of the bolt face itself here. It must not stick out past that. If it does, the round as it feeds up will snag on it and jam the gun. So that must be at best flush. It should be a few thousandths below. And then the extractor hook we mentioned before should be, in fact not should, it has to be positive, or I should say it has to be neutral in its engagement angle. It can be positive, it must not be negative. And you can stick it in, case in, and hook it under the hook and bring it back. And look at the position of the extractor with a case in and a case out. Now most guns I recommend 15 to 25 thousandths extractor spring out. On this gun you don't have to have it, but you have to have some. This one seems to have about 10, which is fine. Another thing to check for is that we have a little chamfer in the bolt face here, and a little chamfer on the extractor. The chamfer on the extractor must be far enough back that when a case comes in lined up, it hits on the angled surface and not flat on top. If it does, the gun won't close. The bolt, and I should say the extractor, will stub on the flat surface of the extractor to the flat surface on the base of the case. Now if that happens, you're going to have to extend that chamfer until the case can line up here and snap over. We also have some feeding tricks, and I have here a barrel and a receiver. And this is good. I got these two pieces apart so you can see exactly how the barrel goes on the receiver. We have threads in the front and a notch right here. And the barrel extension has a peg on it that lines everything up. Now the barrel won't rotate. Then the collar has threads in it. I think you can see them. No, you can't. Anyway, it has threads in that are invisible, and it simply screws on. Now inside of this ring there is a shoulder. The barrel has a shoulder on it, and so when you screw this onto the receiver, it just forces the barrel onto it. The pin aligns it. Now if you look inside of the receiver, we don't have any form of a ramp here at all. But if we put the barrel in, and here you see the two ramps, one there and one there. You'll also notice that the barrel's fully on. There's a little jump right here, a little step. The receiver hangs out farther rearward than the barrel extension goes. Remember, the barrel extension does not stick into the receiver as far as that surface the receiver does. Now, these guns have a tendency to low feed, particularly in the sporting version. And when it does, there's a little modification you can make to make them feed ever so much better. Actually, there's a few modifications you can make to make them feed ever so much better. You have to pull the barrel. Now, before you pull the barrel, you go in with a small tool and you put a very small ramp in the frame right here. Very small, but a small one, but definitely a ramp. And in this case, I'd bring it so that the ramp was about flush with the surface of the ramp in the barrel extension. Just extend it out. Both of them, right and left side. Then you have to pull the barrel. The two ramps in the barrel now have to be moved forward slightly so that we have a little jump from the frame ramp, or receiver ramp in this case, to the barrel extension ramp. Now these aren't ramps here, they're just clearance cuts so that the bolt lugs can go in. But we actually have ramps in these two. And this gun is a staggered row magazine, so it feeds right and left. So here's our two ramps. So we've made a ramp in the frame to match this, and then we will deepen this ramp a few thousandths, so there's a bit of a jump from the frame ramp to the barrel ramp. Now, lots of times the barrel extension will stick out past the frame ramp. In that case, you have to deepen these two ramps until these ramps are in front of the frame or frame ramp. So we have that jump. If this sticks out past the frame in the front, then if a bullet hits right there, that's where it's going to stop. But if you have a slight jump and a slight ramp in the receiver itself, then when the bullet hits slightly below, as they sometimes can, it will feed up. That cartridge nose striking the ramp happens mostly with sporting blunt nose ammunition, can happen with the military pointed also. We frequently have a problem with the magazines that causes low feeding. We fill the magazine pretty well full and then push down the nose of the case or cases and then let them come back up. If they don't return fully and quickly so that the case is right along this edge, if it hangs down like that, then as you shoot it, the cartridge will not want to come all the way up. And it'll have a tendency to stub on the receiver, hit low, and if that ramp isn't right in the barrel and then the receiver, it'll stub. At the same time, you have to have it do the same thing in the rear. Now this one's a little sluggish in the rear, you see? That means that when the bolt clears, that may not pop up high enough for the bolt to pick it up on the return stroke. So we need to arrange the lips of the magazine or the spring of the magazine so that when the bolt clears, that case will pop up. See, this is being a little sluggish about it. There's two things we can do. The first one, we take a pair of flat pliers and very carefully we'll raise the lip in the front in a straight line. Nothing here and no maybe 10 thousandths here. So it allows the rounds to straighten out a little bit this way, so that the front end elevates. Another thing we can do is we can squeeze the magazine in a vise, like so, which gives them a little bit more room to expand. Now we're only talking about a few thousandths, not a lot, just a few thousandths, to allow the cartridges to go from this to this. That will allow them to hit on the bodies more than on the shoulder area more, so that they don't do this as much, but have a tendency to stay stacked better. So we have opened up our lips just a little bit in the front, tapering back to nothing in the rear, just a few thousandths. We've expanded the magazine box a little bit, and yet this one's still a little sluggish in the rear. What we can do is take the magazine apart, and there's lots of different variations of magazines. Some are riveted together, some are tried to be sealed so that they can't take them apart, whatever. The bottom plate will come off, some just easier than others. Lots of times we have a detent in here, there are latch that we can push and unlock it and slide the front off. Sometimes this piece locks it, this little detent. This one we've already freed up and I can pull it out. That takes our spring out. Now if you remember, the back of the cartridge was the one that didn't want to rise. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the spring and adjust it just slightly so that it has a slight arch. And you see that's going to change the angle of the follower from maybe straight like this, so that the back end has more tension. It raises, you see. Slip our bottom plate back on. And check our tension. It's better but not quite enough, and I really should, in this particular gun, open up the front of the shoulder just a little bit. We're going to have to make some adjustments of the lips, or lip. Now what I've done is I've taken the smooth jawed pliers and I've pried the lip up just a little bit, mostly in the front, virtually nothing in the rear. Much, much better. Now I have a little raised spot right here, it's a little high. I'll just take a hammer and tap it down. I'm happy. That should feed fine now. This gun is popular like the 1022 and the AR-7 and several other guns, and so there's lots of custom accessories that you can put on it. Different forearms, different buttstocks, different sights. Most of the accessories I don't think are too very good. This is a military firearm, and it's really not a bad one. And so most of the stuff has been pretty well perfected, thought out, and they've been tested for millions of rounds. They know what they're doing. So you can buy a Colt scope, or you can buy other brands of mounts that fit on here, or they have the flat top receiver that takes a Weaver type mount, and you put most any scope on it that you want. I prefer the flat top receiver for scope mounting, but this one will work. It's held on by one screw. The mount fits in here and has kind of a funny, odd base pattern, and it matches up with this little angled surface here and here. And so it kind of wedges into here, and the one screw holds it on. So it's a quick release scope mount, or sort of quick release scope mount anyway. But it's not my favorite. I prefer the other type. And the hand guards and things that you can buy, and the muzzle brakes and the bipods and everything like that. If you like it, put it on. Otherwise, don't waste your money. But there is a gadget that I think is worthwhile, and I am assuming they still make it. I haven't seen one advertised for a while. But Atchison, and there might be, I'm sure there are other people that make them, makes a cute little gadget. It is a conversion unit for this gun. Converts the 223 centerfire to a 22 long rifle rimfire. It's a self-contained bolt and breech or chamber assembly and a magazine to fit into the receiver. We'll stick it in the gun and show you how it works. I've already taken this one partly apart. And I have already taken the bolt out. Just to show you, I have a spare barrel, of course. It'll fit in the gun like that. So if this piece of barrel fills the chamber of the 223, and then the breech bolt is contained in this tube that acts now as the receiver for the 22. And then the original fire control functions the firing pin. And then we stick in the 22 rimfire magazine. The gun's ready to go. Pull it back, it works normally. When you shoot it, of course, the bolt inside the little receiver is blown back just like it is on a 22. Yet when you want to load it, it loads with the same charging handle as does the centerfire system. This unit, I don't know about the new ones, but this unit, when it first came out, had several problems. Headspace was one, extractor fit was one, firing pin fit was one. Once corrected, this unit seems to work extremely well. This is an accessory I would recommend that you buy. The problem with it is, after a box or two of shells, you've got to take it out and run some regular centerfire stuff through it to clean out that gas tube. Then you go back to 22 rimfire. When we're talking about accessories, there's a few things that I would recommend that you pick up for the gun. I suspect that parts for this model is going to get hard to get. So what you want to do is pick up some spare parts that are likely to give you problems. Magazines are one. They will tend to wear out or break a lip, and then of course they're done. Extractors can wear out, and the springs can fatigue, and they're reasonably inexpensive, so I would suggest that you get a spare extractor and spring. Firing pins don't break very often, and neither does the pin that retains it, but it would not be a bad idea to pick up a spare firing pin and retaining pin. Also in the fire control system, there's nothing there that breaks that couldn't be fixed, but it's nice to have a spare, and you could get a spare hammer because they will sometimes wear a spare trigger and a spare disconnect. Also, the springs for the hammer, not so much the trigger, but the spring for the hammer will get fatigued and would be hard to make, so a spare one of those is handy. And if you want to get spare buttstock and forearm, you can. They're very expensive. Now, if you get aftermarket, it'll be considerably cheaper, but if you get Colt, it's quite expensive. If the stock breaks, then you're going to have to repair it with a type of fiberglass, epoxy rosin. If you use the normal epoxy glues, they don't tend to stick to this type of plastic very well. Fiberglass rosin types with reinforcement will probably repair the stock acceptably, if you get the right stuff at least. There is a part that's kind of pricey, and the gun will work without it, but if you're not mechanically inclined, the hook on the charging handle sometimes wears and will lose its grip, and as you shoot it, it will have a tendency to come open a little bit. It doesn't hurt anything, but it's an annoyance. Now you can simply recut that surface so it's nice and sharp and true, and it'll stay latched. Or if you want to spend about 20 bucks, you can put in a new one. I've never seen a broken pistol grip except when the gun fell and broke it. Normally they don't break. And I'm not going to recommend that you do much with the trigger. I can show you one trick. This gun I think is already okay. When we push the hammer down and let it catch on the secondary sear system, and then you release the trigger slowly, you see the hammer coming forward, the disconnect is losing its grip on the hammer. You want the disconnect to hang on to the hammer until the primary sear system is almost fully engaged. So we'll let it come forward, not caught. Now I'm going to let go of the trigger, and let's see if it moves forward any at all. Just a few thousandths of an inch. This one's set up correctly. Lots of times it'll let go too soon, like it lets go here. Now I'm going to take a screwdriver and I'm going to pry the disconnect off prematurely. Let's say that it didn't fit right, and so it slipped off right there. Guess what happened? It fired. It fired when you pulled the trigger, and then it fired again when you released the trigger. Now with the mood that things are in right now these days, if you have a gun like that, and if you've messed with it for sure, and you get caught, you'll be busted. That's a machine gun by the definition of the law, by the wording of the law. That's a machine gun. More than one shot with a single pull of the trigger. We pull, bang, cycles, we let go, fire it again. That's one pull, 2 shots, that's a machine gun. So watch that. Now to correct that, we had the trigger and disconnect out before. Remember that the disconnect sits on top of the trigger. I don't think you can see down inside it here, but it rests on the trigger. So the disconnect is here, here's the trigger, and the pivot point for the disconnect is here. The hook is up here. What's happening is the trigger returns, the whole disconnect rotates, and let's go to the hammer prematurely. So what you do is you file some material off the underside of the disconnect, allowing it to tip. That moves the hook closer to the secondary sear system of the hammer, therefore it'll let go later as you release the trigger. And it'll stop that doubling when you release the trigger. Makes the gun legal again. If you switch parts and put in military surplus parts or aftermarket parts, lots of these aren't quite right. They've been altered. The military parts have been ground on so that they won't have the full auto capabilities. And the dimension has been changed. And once in a while you get a combination that'll do that. Or maybe you have a negative angle. It was a military part, had worn till it didn't work right, scrapped. Someone bought it for scrap metal, and then sold the parts, and you have a defective hammer or trigger. Remember, the primary sear must be positive. If it's negative, when you let go of the trigger, the disconnect lets go, the primary engages, it's negative, and the hammer simply overpowers it and slips off and fires. Again, it'll get you in trouble. So, primary sear system positive, negative sear system negative, secondary sear system negative, and the secondary sear system hangs on almost to the end of the trigger's return stroke. Just a few thousandths to go, let's go, that's perfect. If you have a short barrel gun, the gas hole size in the barrel is extremely critical. Now the gas hole size in the front sight and the gas tube aren't very critical, but the hole in the barrel is very critical. The gas is taken off at a closer point to the chamber, it's closer to the peak pressure curve of the charge, so that if we have one load that has 50,000 pounds here, another load is 30 and another load is 40. There's going to be less gas getting to the bolt to drive it back. And if the gun is balanced to function as a load at 50,000 pounds at this point, then when you shoot a 30,000 pound load that won't get enough gas, the gun will short cycle. If the gun is short cycling with a load that you want to use, then you need to give it more gas. So you would remove the front sight and open up the gas hole a thousandth or two, put it back together and try shooting it until it cycles reliably with the load you want to use. Now the way to tell is to put one round in the magazine, put it in the gun, load it, shoot it. The gun should open, eject, and the bolt should lock back. That tells us that it's full stroking. Now with the gas hole full length, the full length guns, it is not a problem, and you have much more tolerance in gas hole size and load. But when you get the gas hole up here on the short barrel guns, it's very critical, and a thousandth or two will make a difference, or a slight change in load. If you go from a 55 grain load to a 50 grain load, the gun may or may not work when it's short. So shortening them causes some problems. That's short cycling. There are other causes of short cycling, of course, leaks here and there. But here's one that they tell us causes short cycles, but in reality, I found that it does not. And that is, you read in the books, and the magazines, and the periodicals, and everything, that the gas tube must be a tight fit in the key. That's not necessarily so. If you have enough gas coming down, this fit doesn't seem to be too critical. Even though they say it has a slip fit, you can have a few thousandths clearance. And I think the reason for this is that the gas is flowing very rapidly, and so it tends to keep going that direction. It goes right into this chamber and does its thing. Or if it were blocked and had to come straight down or had a lot of irregularities, then it might make a big difference. But it does not seem to. Even though you'll read it, it does not seem to make any difference if you got a slip fit or 5 thousandths clearance. Now if you have 25 thousandths, that might be a different story, but a little clearance doesn't seem to hurt anything. There is another problem, and it causes short cycling or failure to open. It also causes failure to close. Now if we look at this bolt, we'll notice that it rides on what amounts to 4 little rails. It's here and here and here and here. With Colt, I've never had a problem, but with the aftermarket stuff, lots of times, the chamber in the barrel, the barrel extension, the hole in the receiver, the hole in the bolt carrier aren't all on the same axis. And so when the bolt tries to go closed, it may in fact close. And you shoot it and the cartridge case puffs up. And because it's out of alignment and the cartridge case is fatter now, it takes up the space it had and pushes the bolt assembly over to one side. And then it has to open under quite a bit of strain. And that takes extra gas and it doesn't have it and the gun short cycles. Or if it's really bad, it won't even close reliably and you have to shove it closed, force it closed. And then of course when you shoot it, it has trouble cycling unless you really got a lot of gas. The cure is to find out which side it's rubbing on. If it's high, you would relieve these a little bit, these two runners. If it's right, you'd relieve this one, and maybe the top one, to allow the bolt to drift that way. Left, same difference. And what you're doing is relieving the bolt enough that it can find its center in this off-center gun. And then it won't bind the bolt assembly when it has to lock and unlock, and the gun will fly. Now that's a relatively common problem with aftermarket. As I said before, I've never seen it with a Colt. And now you know as much about this gun as I do.